Hi, my name is Guido Tagliavini, and today I'm going to talk about our paper, Paging and the Address Translation Problem. Our start point is the classic paging problem. In this problem, there are two memories, RAM, which is fast and can hold at most P pages, and storage, which is slow but has unbounded capacity. This memory is holding a number of pages, and there is a request sequence of pages, sigma, given by an adversary. And when the adversary accesses page PI, if PI is in RAM, an event that is called a cache hit, then the cost is 0. But if PI is in storage, which is called a cache miss, then PI needs to be fetched from storage, and this has a cost of 1. Moreover, if RAM is already full, we need the page eviction algorithm to make room for the incoming page. So the paging problem consists of designing the page eviction algorithm in a way that optimizes the paging cost. So suppose the next page in the sequence sigma is P2. This page is in RAM, so the access cost is 0. The next access is to P14, but in this case the page is in storage, so we need to fetch it. Since RAM is full, the page eviction algorithm has to pick a page, and then we can swap these two pages. The cost of this access is 1. The reason we are interested in the paging problem is because it is part of a broader system called virtual memory, which is the main topic of this paper. So roughly speaking, virtual memory is an abstraction of RAM and storage. To be more concrete, programs see memory as a very large array of page slots. Each slot in this array has an index which is called a virtual address, and this array is really an abstract view of the memory because pages are actually located either in RAM or storage. The index of a page in RAM is called physical address. When the program accesses a page, it does it using a virtual address PI. Then the page must be served in RAM just like in the paging problem, and therefore the page, once it's served, will have an associated physical address. So let's say the program accesses a page that is already in RAM, like in this case. Then, to locate the page, the virtual address has to be translated into its existing physical address. But if the accessed page is in storage, then it needs to be fetched first. And only once the page is in RAM, the virtual to physical translation can be performed. Therefore, accessing a virtual page PI consists of two steps: paging PI, in case the page is in storage, plus translating PI into its physical address. So the paging component of virtual memory is simply the paging problem. But what about translation? To perform a translation, we need to convert a virtual address into its physical address. And to do this, there is a dictionary with all virtual address to physical address mappings called the page table. For instance, here we have that page P1 maps to slot 2 in RAM, P2 maps to slot 9, and it also indicates that P14 is in storage. So a translation can be performed via a lookup in the page table. So what's the cost of a virtual memory access? Well, it's the paging cost, which we already know that it is either 0 or 1, plus the translation cost. Translations are lookups in the page table, and we define this cost to be epsilon. Epsilon is much smaller than 1 because a page table lookup is much cheaper than paging. So if epsilon is so small, and in particular much smaller than doing an I/O, why do we care about it? Doesn't it get absorbed by the paging cost? And the answer is no, because not every access needs an I/O, and in fact most of them will not require any paging at all, but every access needs a translation. So in fact, not only this cost may dominate the overall access cost, but we have to pay for this all the time. So this ends up being too expensive. So for this reason, there is a hardware cache with frequently used virtual to physical mappings. That's called the TLB, which stands for Translation Leukocyte Buffer. This is a very small cache and holds a subset of all the mappings that are in the page table. The cost of a lookup in the TLB is negligible relative to epsilon, so we model this as 0. So summarizing our journey so far, virtual memory is composed by a translation part that uses a cache called TLB and a paging part that uses a cache called RAM. Each of these caches has a different miscost given by the two equations at the bottom, and of course each cache will have an eviction algorithm to make room for new elements if they get full. So let's say we have a request sequence sigma and the next page is P2. This translation is in the TLB, and therefore the page is also in RAM, and so the overall cost is 0. Next, we need to serve P1, which is not in TLB, but it is in RAM, so we pay the TLB miscost epsilon, but we pay no paging cost. The TLB at this point can choose whether or not to incorporate this mapping, because at this point the translation is already resolved, so we know what the physical address is. And this is in contrast with RAM, which always needs to read the page. So in this case, the TLB will choose to ignore this mapping and move on. So finally, we have a request for P14, which incurs misses in both the TLB and RAM, so the overall cost of this access is 1 plus epsilon. So the page, in this case, is going to be fetched from storage. The page table entry is updated with the new physical address, which is 8. And now the TLB again can choose whether to insert this into the table or not. And so in this case, it chooses to insert it, but the TLB is full, so it has to pick an entry, say this one, remove it, and now we have room to insert this new entry. So this may give the impression that this problem is just two instances of the paging problem put together. However, the TLB has a special feature that sets it apart from a normal cache, and this feature will enable further algorithmic analysis. So what's this feature? What makes a TLB special is that it stores pointers to chunks of data rather than the data itself. So here we have a TLB, the green field is a virtual address and the pink one is the corresponding physical address. The virtual address is a pointer to a virtual page and the physical address is a pointer to a physical page. So what's cool about this is that increasing the size of the chunks that we point to increases the amount of virtual addresses the TLB can translate. So the idea here is that we map a range of virtual pages into a range of physical pages. The entries of the TLB are exactly the same. Now the virtual address in the TLB points to the beginning of this virtual range and the physical address points to the beginning of the physical range. And then we can translate the ith page in this range of pages into the ith page of the physical range. So in other words, this means that performance of a TLB depends not only on its content, as in a regular cache, but it also depends on how we use that content. And this adds a whole new dimension to this caching problem. These ranges of contiguous pages are called huge pages, and we distinguish them depending on whether they live in the virtual space or the physical space. In the first case, we call them virtual huge pages, and otherwise we call them physical huge pages. Of course, using huge pages comes at a cost. When a new entry is inserted into the TLB, we need to fetch all pages that constitute the physical huge page into RAM, or if they are already in RAM or scattered around, we need to reallocate them and place them together one next to the other. So this creates additional costs, which means that huge pages are not all good. The good side of huge pages is that virtual huge pages reduce the translation cost because the TLB is able to translate more virtual addresses. But physical huge pages incur substantial overhead. They increase the paging cost because we need to fetch more pages to create one of these huge pages, and they also create reallocation costs in case we need to move pages around to create it. So a big open question is, can we have the translation cost of huge pages without any or minimum overhead? In other words, can we have the good things of huge pages without all the bad things? In our paper, we accomplished two things. First, we formally defined the address translation problem, and then we answered this open question by showing that we can get the translation cost of huge pages with the paging cost of regular pages and performing no reallocation at all. So regarding the address translation problem, we have already discussed most of the important aspects of its definition, but there are of course some details that I haven't mentioned, and please find those in the paper. So in the remaining of this talk, I will focus on the second point, how to get the goodies of huge pages without bad things. At a high level, we want to keep virtual huge pages, but we want to break up physical huge pages into the normal pages that constitute them. We want to be able to map these normal pages independently, like this, and thus we would like to have the mapping information for all of them in a single TLB entry. Moreover, we want to allow holes in a huge page so that we only need to fetch pages that are actually accessed. The main challenge is that only one physical address fits in a TLB entry. So the question we want to answer is, can we shrink the number of bits we require per physical address? And the main idea we use to tackle this question is to restrict the placement of pages in RAM. To be more specific, we use the notion of Low-associativity, which means that every page can be placed in at most L slots in RAM. For instance, typically when pages are placed in RAM, this is done in a fully associative way. Pages can land anywhere in RAM. But by reducing the associativity L, we also reduce the number of bits we need to describe its location. And how much do we reduce this number of bits? Well, if we can only place a page in L different places, then we need about log L bits to describe its position. Unfortunately, low associativity introduces a new trade-off. It may create hotspots, and this causes some extra paging. Let me show you what I mean. Let's suppose each page can land in two different spots. So we get a new page, we get inserted into RAM, and both spots are free, so the page chooses one of them. We get a new page, there is one of the two spots that is empty, so the page is placed there. Another one. And now we get a page that can only be placed in these two slots that are already occupied. So we first need to evict one of these pages in order to insert the new page. Now we get a new page, and again both slots are already full, so we need to evict one of these pages to insert this new one. And in both cases, these IOs were unnecessary since there were plenty of slots available in this piece of RAM. So the question is, can we have both low associativity and low paging cost? Before diving into the answer of this question, let me note that this is 100% a question about the paging algorithm, because it is the paging algorithm that decides where pages are placed when they are fetched. And thus, in fact, L-associativity is a property of the paging algorithm. So the question we want to answer is there a low associativity paging algorithm with low paging cost? The approach that we take is the following. We give a black box transformation that, given any paging algorithm, it produces a new paging algorithm that has roughly the same paging cost, but with much lower associativity. Formally, the theorem that we prove is the following. Let A be any online paging algorithm on a RAM of size almost P. So this is a tiny resource augmentation assumption. Then there is an online L-associative paging algorithm B on a RAM of size P, such that the associativity L is roughly log P, and the paging cost of B is about the paging cost of A with high probability. And therefore, this theorem immediately gives us log P bit addresses at almost the same paging cost. To summarize our solution, this is what we wanted. We started out from a paging algorithm with good paging cost and that operates at the size of normal pages. Then we use our black box transformation to get a paging algorithm with roughly the same cost but low associativity. This allows us to have small addresses, and therefore we can pack multiple addresses in a single TLB entry. The translation cost that we get is that of virtual huge pages, and the paging cost is essentially the paging cost of the paging algorithm we picked, plus some little of one overhead. Thank you very much.